So I had the luxury of speaking to the panelists ahead of time, and I realized that two of them just came from Vietnam. One talked about the regulatory environment in Southeast Asia. So I wanted to get, sort of boots on the ground perspective since we have you guys here.
Pavel, you first, or?
Yeah, so I'm actually from Singapore. Moved there 2 years ago from Vancouver, and being with Charles, we didn't get a chance to hook up last week, but there's a conference in Ho Chi Minh, and what blew me away. So I was invited there to moderate a couple of panels and speak, and I thought, okay, it's Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. This should be interesting. But it was slammed. It had, 2,500 people?
Yeah, around
2,500 attendees. The entire room, and then people said to me after, oh, maybe it was people from the region coming in. No, it was all locals because they had translators there, and the mics and everything set up so people can hear what's going on in English. And what I realized there was that despite what the mainstream here says, or the banking world about Bitcoin blockchain is no, it's the emerging markets that are going to power all this because they're hungry to learn. Like Robby talked about the developing markets. They're all there ready, just hungry to learn and educate themselves, from the cryptocurrencies to the technology projects to the infrastructure. They're just ready to devour it all.
Yeah, IOHK focuses very heavily on the developing world. In fact, I'm going to Ethiopia in May, and we already have operations in Barbados. So we're very passionate about the unbanked world. But Vietnam is a great emerging market. It's actually one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. And the government there is definitely willing to do things with blockchain technology. They're still trying to figure out, though, what cryptocurrencies mean. So they're still in that epic fight between cryptocurrency and blockchain, and which side of the spectrum do you want to be on. But the everyday people love cryptocurrencies. They absolutely love them, and the adoption is just extraordinary. So the conference was great. There were about 3,000 people, as we mentioned. A lot of local businesses as well, not just global businesses coming to Vietnam to say, hey, look what we can do. It's actually, I say, about half of the attendees were Vietnamese or in that area of Asia. So that was really fun to watch. And actually, IBL has done this conference before, and the conference quadrupled in size since the last time they had it. And so that's just 1 year of growth. So it could be 10,000 people the next time they do it.
Yeah, we were in India a couple months ago working with the government there, and one thing that struck me was that in India alone, over the next 5 years, 1 billion new people will be banked. And they're not going to be banked using a traditional brick and mortar bank. They're going to be banked using their phone. And the kind of experience that they're going to expect with the mobile wallet on their phone are instant payments. And that's something that we're all working towards. A lot of us on the panel, but they're leapfrogging the Western world in terms of adoption of new innovative products like cryptocurrencies and blockchain, because they're essentially not even going to retail stores or computers, but they're actually getting banked on a mobile phone.
Yeah, look how fast WeChat grew in China.
Absolutely, or Alipay and Line in Japan and Southeast Asia. These companies didn't exist 2 years ago, and now they're just eating up the entire market. And I thought that was pretty interesting about Southeast Asia and Asia in general.
I also wanted to highlight sort of the depth of tech experience on this panel. So Kristen used to be on the biz dev side and is now product manager of engineering. We have a CTO, we have 2 CEOs. So just quickly, if you look back into the years that you've spent at your respective firms, I think Kristen joined Coinbase when it was only 25 people. What are the biggest learnings from the technology side, the fact that you've actually built real technologies?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the first thing I learned is that we all speak about how it's this really big challenge. We're doing this new thing no one's done. But 3/4 of our problems are exactly the same as the problems every other major scaling tech company has had. And so I think that was my biggest takeaway. And then the second piece, which is basically that the first thing, our assumption is true. We are also trying to build this entire industry. So some of the things we face, no other industry has had to face. I just think that that's a smaller proportion than the overall problems we've seen.
And to add that, at least the learnings that our team has found is that in a lot of these problems that you're attending to, it doesn't require immediate transformation on the first step, like on the first proof of concept. And if you take that approach, what you find is that you can actually attend to a lot of huge problems, even just operationally, with that simple step. I know for a lot of social impact projects, and we've seen it with building blocks with the World Food Program in terms of using self-sovereign identity to get resources like food and refugee camps, that it's very much scalable, right? It might not be scalable for, in contrast to Visa, 1 million transactions a second, but in a lot of other use cases, it's perfectly usable. And until we get to a point in which it is a little bit more helpful in contexts that require a lot more throughput, like data processing and so forth, we can help the projects that are, doing off-chain processing, Raiden Network, Plasma, et cetera, to get to that point. But I don't want to make it seem that, blockchain is completely incapable and things aren't being done. There are a lot of things being done. But some of the bigger things that I think we initially put our eye on are going to take a little time.
So we do a lot of peer-reviewed research at IOHK. We have 3 research centers. One's at University of Edinburgh, one's at Tokyo Tech, and one's at University of Athens. And we actually have professors and postdocs sit down and write papers and put those papers through conferences like Crypto and Eurocrypt. So it gives us a nice God's eye view of what's the state of the art in terms of the science of the space, and what can you not do and what can you do. And generally speaking, most of the problems that we see in terms of scale are less about, well, can blockchain technology do this or not? And it's more about, well, where do you need to centralize and where do you need to decentralize? That's kind of the challenge, is that people think that they need to just decentralize everything because blockchain. But the reality is that you're almost always trusting something or someone at the end of the rainbow, either a root of trust somewhere or there's like some asset that's being issued by a central authority. So who cares if it's over a decentralized payment system? If the bank goes up, the asset's useless, right? So thinking in systems and being able to say, well, how does that system port into a real-life problem, I think is the hard part. It's not about the underlying technological primitives. There's plenty of good protocols, and there's plenty of good ways of solving problems. I mean, Ripple is a federated system, but it's perfect for what they're trying to do. They don't need proof of work. It would be counterproductive for the business model that they've chosen and for the clients that they deal with. And so they've been able, because they've made good architectural choices in their tech stack, to optimize around that and build a great company. I think that's the big challenge for most entrepreneurs here, is you either borrow someone else's stack and they don't really fully understand the trade-off profile they're getting, or they try to decentralize way too soon when decentralization is counterproductive for their business model.
I think that's such a good point. There's 2 things to consider. One, it's really hard to get the user experience right with a completely decentralized system. So you think about, we get a number of support calls today about how to reset your XRP or Bitcoin password. That just doesn't work. It doesn't. I mean, that's a hard user experience challenge to solve. And the second thing I think Charles hinted at is, to what level do you need to decentralize? Because decentralizing applications is probably 20 times more complicated than a centralized application. So choosing where you want to decentralize and choosing where, like, hey, AWS and some centralized system works better is something we're not really considering a lot of. I think we've shifted completely to everything needs to be decentralized in the blockchain world, where in the reality it has to be more of a product-led decision between one or the other.
You actually sort of touched on my next question, is there's been a lot of hype about turning everything into blockchain, right? What are your respective opinions on what should be, or use cases of, what is a perfect use case versus what is not, what can be decentralized, what should not be?
Well, it's about trust and coordination. So wherever you need to coordinate people and you need to better quantify trust and you don't fully trust any person, that's a perfect use case for a blockchain technology. So I think of things like property ledgers, identity management systems, credential management. For example, we have a project we're doing in Greece right now. We're taking university diplomas and putting them up on a blockchain, a private permission ledger. Okay, that just makes sense because it gives you the ability to have auditability and timestamping and immutability in the record. It makes absolutely no sense for the vast majority of enterprise use cases. Most records are somewhat mutable, and most things need high performance. Like I hear a lot, like, oh, let's apply AI to blockchain. I can't for the life of me understand what the hell that means. I really can't.
It's 2 buzzwords.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then
Let's sprinkle
some IoT on it too, because we like getting VC money. So there's plenty of ways that you can misuse it, but my view is just trust and coordination, and there's plenty of great use cases that Hyperledger has demonstrated and other people in the enterprise ledger world have demonstrated. Now, the other side of it is the dApp side, and there, a lot of these dApps make no sense at all because they don't actually need their own token. They can run with Ether just fine, but I guess people like raising money, so that's why they have tokens. So I say 95% of the things I see don't require decentralization and don't require a blockchain at the end of the rainbow.
I would comment on another thing to that list of things that it's going to be extremely useful for, governance and reputation, and portable reputation across dApps is something that I'm seeing is going to be incredibly important, right? Because I mean, you have all these people creating dApps, and they have their own respective reputation systems, but if they don't communicate across each other, then it's kind of the same system that you had, just in a different light. Governance, just because, and again, I come from a social impact perspective. One of my main concerns is what are the current incentives for traditional systems to act maliciously? So, again, if there's a need for trustlessness, then that's the perfect case scenario. A big concern how banks are going about it, just because in a lot of the architectures, only the central banks have nodes, and in a lot of these consortiums that involve rural banks, right? So the people that you're trying to get banked, they don't have any governance within that system. So, if I was a central bank, I have the incentive to, create economic arbitrage systems in which you silo liquidity from rural areas or charge higher fees and things like that. That's kind of where I'm a little bit at a difference with some of the implementations out there. But I agree. I mean, and we see this with the regulatory scene when it comes to utility tokens. Not all dApps need a membership token, right? If it's not being used for some type of special governance that needs to be shielded away from like secondary markets. And this is what's having us, or the SEC come out and say that essentially all these are securities until the protocol exists, which unfortunately in many cases it doesn't.
So we also have the luxury of having some of the biggest blockchain companies on the panel. We have Coinbase, we have Ripple, we have Bluzelle. We obviously have Charles that has 9-figure revenue. Wanted to hear your thoughts on what are your biggest learnings from, the expansion, scaling, and adoption side.
But I think the one thing is, starting with the customer problem, not with the technology. And so I think it's really sexy right now just to start with, let's just develop a decentralized, system and a cryptocurrency and try to tackle some sort of use case. Where I think going back to basics and really understanding the customer problem and having that focus on solving that customer problem again and again, I think is missing today a lot from the blockchain space. But I think that's just been heart and soul to what we've been developing at Ripple for 5 years. But it's really always starting with what that customer problem is and then wrapping the solution around it. And so I think if you have more of that kind of focus, you'll be successful in your blockchain or whatever company you're at. But I think that's missing today from the ecosystem that I see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. So when I started, Coinbase had merchant tools. And what we were doing is offering corporations in America the ability to accept Bitcoin. And what that meant is that customers could spend their Bitcoin, which was actually worse than using credit cards and getting miles. And we invested a lot of time in that. And it was a way that we put the technology first, right? And we didn't look far enough into the customer problem. And tying it back in, I mean, what's my experience been? It's hard. Just flat out hard, and every day it changes. If you'd asked me 3 years ago when we all believed Bitcoin was more or less all there was, that people would be raising hundreds of millions of dollars in ICOs, I would not have guessed that, not in a million years.
We're at 4.5 billion now.
Yeah. Individual companies raising these hundreds of millions. So I think like to bring it back to the use cases, I can't pretend to know. Every day is a new day in this industry,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you've had similar
100%,
experiences.
Yeah, it's 100% accurate.
Yeah, for us it was going back to what Asheesh said, problem solution. Like, you know, I had a startup beforehand, and you always just focused on that, right? I was in Silicon Valley with 500 startups. So we had initially, like we did work with Ripple. Our whole thing was, hey, enterprises need blockchain. So in Singapore, we were actually doing stuff for HSBC, OCBC, MUFG, some of the biggest banks out there. And what we realized was we're building them basically identity management system over Ethereum, and it was consumer data. We're like, oh, where are we going to store this? And we came into that problem. It was like, well, we're putting in a centralized system. We're using Microsoft Azure. We had to kind of blockchainify it to make it work with Ethereum. We're like, this is a huge pain. Right. And we're like, and if this is where the direction is everything's going to go, and we're having this problem, everyone else is going to have this problem. And so that's when we realized, like, let's start applying and building out a decentralized database. And I think for some of the traction we got over the past 6 months was because it was an organic thing that happened. It wasn't just, hey, let's just build this thing and people kind of believe it. We always had the story that it came from a real problem that we discovered ourselves, which is usually the best way to do it. That let's solve our own problem, and that ends up being a solution for everybody else.
And a comment on Pavel's thoughts, and this talking more on the developer front, right? Is that there are two fronts, right, of adoption. You know, you have developers, and then you have kind of mainstream consumers, whether they're using dApps or they're using, you know, any type of cryptocurrency. I think on the dApp front, a huge barrier to adoption there is user experience. Guys, applications and dApps, same thing. Like, just because you have blockchain in your name doesn't mean you just get to change the whole user experience.
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah. You know, it still should be intuitive.
Yeah.
And you know, obviously there's kind of the issue. There's a financial cultural issue with using cryptocurrencies for a lot of people. And right now, given that we're still in this token sales obsession stage, people are seeing it less as a utility token to operate a particular system and more of as like a speculative investment. And I think that's going to have to change. So in a lot of ways, you know, I really hope that there's going to be less legal ambiguity, and that, you know, bodies like the SEC start to make some hardline decisions, because that then starts to kind of curve where the conversation is going to go. You know, and BitConnect is a perfect example. And then on the developer side, it's really, you know, leading the path in terms of, okay, what are the hardest problems for this, right? It's still not easy to push adapt to mainnet on Ethereum. It kind of sucks. It's actually harder than writing the smart contract or all the code, you know? Like, getting it on local, that's easy, right? Or relatively. And I think those type of problem sets are going to have to be solved. So UX, you know, roadmaps for, you know, pushing the mainnet, getting your thing set up, and kind of financial culture around getting used to using cryptocurrencies in a productive way.
Robby, I'm actually a little curious, sorry if you don't mind. I was at a hackathon at Duke, and everybody wanted to use the blockchain, but only one person could figure out how to write a smart contract in that weekend.
Yeah.
So from your experience, do you feel like the developer world is far enough along that these cases can actually get built, or do you think that the technology has further to go before it's sort of accessible and usable and can be built on by most developers?
I think for developers coming, and this is true even for like not smart contracts, for like Angular, JS, you know, 2+ and React and stuff, is that a lot of computer science majors come out of university without knowledge of how to build consumer applications. They usually come with some knowledge of, you know, theory and use of Java or C++, but like developing mobile and web apps, usually they have to learn on the job when they enter Cisco or Google or whichever. So I think that's one huge issue, is that you have to teach yourself the consumer kind of coding. And then with regards to smart contracts, there's also a different thinking involved. It's almost a different computer engineer, because I can make an inefficient JavaScript script that like automates whatever, right? And it could be inefficient as hell, but if it works, I'm like, okay, cool, you know, we can figure out that other stuff later. But if you do that in a smart contract, you could lose, you know, $100 million, you know? So the implications are a lot worse. And you can only push to mainnet once.
Right.
Right? So, you're forced to be a lot more responsible. And I think scaling with Ethereum in terms of its updates are going to introduce some more apologetic things.
I think one of the biggest issues is we still have to figure out where the smart contract fits into the traditional application stack. I mean, the reality is you're not going to run your entire application on a blockchain. There's going to be a server at the end of the rainbow. There's a client-side experience. And really, the smart contract is a service for verified computation. You're saying, I can't really trust the server to run X, Y, and Z, so I'm trusting the blockchain to do that. But there are competing models for that. We do look at them. Standard verified computation techniques like Pinocchio or Geppetto, or you can use multi-party computation. So we have a lab that studies that, but there's also the Enigma project. So there's going to be a bit of effort over the next few years to sort all of this out. And there's still a big debate over what is the best model to run these types of things in, whether it be a replicated virtual machine or a trusted server or a federation of trusted servers or off-chain through some sort of state channel network. Now, in terms of developer experience, we write Haskell code and Isabelle and Coq and these things. There's like 12 people that do that. It's so we've already, as a company, drank the poison of the worst development experience ever. But we do believe we need to bring mainstream languages into the smart contract space. So we invest very heavily with a partner called Runtime Verification out of University of Illinois on something called the K framework. And what this is going to do is allow you to actually write Java and C and C++ and JavaScript-based smart contracts very soon using something called semantics-based compilation. And actually, to add new language support, we just have to write the operational semantics once of the language and then put it onto the blockchain, which only takes a few weeks to do that. So that's something that'll be coming to Cardano and no doubt ported to other platforms at some point in the future. But I suspect that within the next few years, the development experience will get much better and much easier to predict, and the tools will be better, and the scale will be better, and so forth. But the biggest issue is conceptual. It's not technological. It's where does the smart contract actually fit in my app stack? Why am I using it? And who's the consumer of that?
So I'm going to conclude the panel on that. Find the technology that fits your problem.